Welcome, everybody, to today's live stream about the Al Jazeera documentary Palestine 1920. Pretty sure that it was produced in 2020 as a 100-year retrospective. And I thought it'd be nice to take a break. I think a lot of times, understandably, we have to look at really difficult things on Palestine Bookshelf. And this was mostly because I think the documentary ends on a difficult note, but mostly a chance to look back, I think, and smile in some ways at what Palestine was without connecting it to its loss and seeing what a vibrant society it was, how full it was of life, how much opportunity there was. And I say that because it is possible again. When we think about how things are in history, we often have currency bias. We think about the present tense and we think because this is how it is now, that's how it's always going to be. And people don't realize, particularly when they're close to the end of something, that it's about to end. And I'm not saying that things are necessarily going to end today, tomorrow, next week. But when I see a documentary like this, it gives me hope for the future, not because I think something is going to happen tomorrow, but because I know that things come and go in human history. That Napoleon thought he would reign for a long time. So did the man in Germany. For whatever reasons they did or they didn't. But the point is, the people in that time period thought that that was going to go on for a very long time. And they had reasons to think that. So, too, if you're able to cast back and look at history, so many things have come and gone in Palestine over the years. And I love that they started the documentary by going back to 1516 and talking about Greater Syria and recognizing that Palestine was the southern province of Greater Syria. The narrative was there was nobody here, except you have very developed cities. We have a train station in 1892 in Jerusalem. There were 11 tile floor factories in Jaffa alone. Think about that. Think about what it means to have that many variations in a particular industry. It means that that industry is doing really well because it can handle all of that competition, and all of those different businesses can serve different niches. That's what's wonderful in a market economy. And don't confuse market economy with capitalism. People like to think that nobody in the previous history of the world ever bought and sold with each other until capitalism came along and changed all of that. But that's people's fault for not really studying economics. You have Nablus as a soap specialist area. People loved soap from Nablus. Hebron was known for leather products. In general, Palestine was known as a center for manufacturing. In the same way, I would suppose that Asia is known for that now, a particular growing very much Vietnam. China has, in a sense, moved on to another stage of manufacturing now, much more advanced manufacturing, because they have a much more a much more educated populace in some of these fine things. This is something people don't realize. Recently, some time ago, when the under the first Trump administration, there were tariffs about microchips. Taiwan tried to diversify and move some semiconductor factories to the United States. The problem was there are not enough educated people in the United States to work in a semiconductor factory. It's not like putting together a car. And even today, putting together cars are much more sophisticated than they were in the time of, lunchbox swinging American factory workers. And this is part of the problem with the president is he thinks we can go back to that era. But the world, in a sense, has moved on from that kind of manufacturing. There's a lot more robots. There's a lot more technology. There's a lot more requirement for an engineering background. And these are educational skills that these other countries have that the United States doesn't. Palestine had that at this time. They were importing modern luxury devices. I loved hearing that Haifa's streets played music all the time. They had all of these gramophones playing music from not just their own tradition. There's a rich tradition. If you've ever heard of some of these, I'm still learning. I'm still learning some of the basics of Arabic music and music of the region. But they were also playing other types of music, and how wonderful it might have been to walk through Haifa and hear music playing in that time. There's also a story about an orphanage founded in 1932 by Haj Amin al Husseini, the Grand Mufti, and they managed to put together an orchestra. The San Remo conference in 1920 was a big win for the Zionists and made a great improvement versus what had happened before, in that some Zionists had come, tried, and left. They didn't really stick with it. But with the appointment of Herbert Samuel post World War One as the first governor general of Palestine, the reason this is a big win for the Zionists is Herbert Samuel was a Zionist. And a wonderful part of the documentary is they animate, and but it's not moving animation. They basically had animated Herbert Samuel at one end of the table and the Palestinian representatives of the people on the other side of the table. And Samuel is making the regular Zionist arguments. If these people move here, they're going to help you with your economy. And the response is, we don't need their help. We have plenty of our own people who know how to do this. Um, and we have needs for the land because we are going to have children, and those children are going to need land, and we need to expand. So we don't really want to encourage immigration from people who are not native to this land anyway. So it was interesting to see that set, because we obviously don't have any recordings of that conversation. So putting it in an animated format and letting those voices play out, reading, I think, quotes out from reports as to what was said in those conferences, is illustrative of the fact that the British knew that the Palestinians had objections, but they had an iron will, along with the Zionists, to just oppose them and run them over. I think potentially, well, there are two things that we close the documentary with. One is that Jews that were working inside the British administration would help forge citizenship paperwork for their friends and family, or whoever paid the money, or whoever they were instructed to do that. So you would get people, and it was fascinating in the documentary. They have a copy of Shimon Peres's application for Palestinian citizenship. A future prime minister of Israel applied for citizenship in Palestine and got it, right? But remember, there's no such thing as Palestine. At the very, very end of the documentary, the person who's talking to us was an eyewitness of 1948. And he talks about it in a very reserved way, because you can see it's difficult for him to relive it and difficult for him to talk about it. And we find out he dies shortly after this documentary. Probably not because of the documentary, but he was just an older gentleman. But the last story he tells us in the documentary is very difficult, but it's about a his father, who, once they were kicked off, he said he was able to survive. He said, my father could survive because he could still see the trees growing on our land. He said, but one day he saw a bulldozer uh, take out the trees, and he said, and then his father just cried like a child, and died of sadness, broken heart, probably. And so there was a thriving society. We have documentation of it. We have photographs. We have films. They were building. They were constructing. They had movie theaters. They had people active in government. They had a sense of culture. They had a sense of who they were. Um, Orphanages were putting together orchestras. So I think a wonderful documentary, and as they say, a sense of hope if you take the long view of history. It's often said, I've come to not believe this attribution, because I can't find proof of it anywhere. But it was famously asked of Deng Xiaoping what he thought of the French Revolution, and he said it's too soon to tell. So I don't believe that he said this, but I still think the sentiment makes sense. That when we think about Palestine, in a sense, it's too soon to tell. We can look at the current events and think that it's the darkest hour for the Palestinians, and in many ways it is. But very famously, we know that it's always darkest right before the dawn. Easy for me to say. I have running water. I'm not getting shot at. But I do know, because I've seen it myself, I don't think there's ever been more awareness of Palestine worldwide than there is right now. Maybe there was in 49, maybe there was in 67, 68. But I can tell you from being alive in 2023, 2024, 2025, the number of people I know who are tuned in to this in some way, whether they're doing something about it or not so important. But knowing that what is happening is wrong is the first step in making a change. So I am going to finish my comments on this documentary on the same hope that I saw in the documentary, that Palestinian people thrive. And I'll see if I can share it with you, but I put it on Substack, just an absolutely beautiful, um, graceful, astonishing. Um, See if I can put in the chat. This young woman had planned to get married, and her husband was killed. Her husband to be was killed, and she just leads with grace. She isn't resentful or angry. She said, "If this is what God wills, I accept it. Um, may God be blessed." And just a deep resignation. 20 years old. So let me see if this link works. So I put the link in the chat. I reposted this in my Substack. Um, I'm just in awe. I'm in awe of a woman like that. I'm in awe of these people who really, if you are familiar with the book of Job in the Bible, if you're not, I'll give you a quick synopsis. Famously, Satan says to God, "Well, it's easy for people to praise you when everything goes right for them because you bless them. But what happens when you take away your blessings?" And um, Job is then selected, in a sense, to show that God, um, that there are people who serve God selflessly, and Job has everything taken from him: his properties, his children, everything. And in fact, at some point, his wife and friends say, well, his friends say, "You must have done something wrong." And his wife says, "Why don't you curse God and die?" Effectively, and Job refuses to do this. Um, the Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away. Blessed be the name of the Lord, is what Job says. And I see that spirit of Job in this young woman, that she was hoping to be married to this man that she loved desperately. It was taken from her, and she said, "It's God's will, and God be blessed." I was so astonished, edified, um, blown away by that. And I hope that you'll take a moment to watch it. And I'll, if hopefully it shows up in the chat, and then I'll try to add it to the description of the video later when the stream's over. But if you want to comment on that as well, if you've had a chance to watch it, please feel free. But she is part of the motif I'm trying to convey today: hope amongst the ruins, hope among difficult difficulties and unbelievable tragedy and hatred, that there is a chance for the future. And I encourage you all to take a more positive view. All right. That's all I have to say on that for today. Are there any questions, any comments, any thoughts before we wrap up today's stream? All right. Well, thank you for stopping by. We won't have a stream next week just because I have some commitments, but we'll resume our streams the first week in May. So we'll just take a week off and then we'll be back. And if you have thoughts or comments after this stream, please feel free to keep the conversation going in the comments. And um, I always love to learn from you all and keep the conversation going with those ideas. Ping says, "Free Palestine, from the river to the sea."